Hello everyone, my name's Annie Claude and I am an extension educator at University of Minnesota focusing on fruit and vegetable production. And today in this presentation, I will be talking about how to plant and trellis a raspberry patch at your own house. And I will be basing a lot of this presentation, especially the trellising section, on the particular raspberry patch that I planted in my own garden last year, which is what you see pictured on the left here. When we plant a raspberry patch, there are a few goals to keep in mind and a few things that we want to get right. First, we want to have the right varieties. Make sure that you are planting the type of variety that will give you fruit at the time of the season that you want fruit. There are two different types of raspberries, summer bearing and fall bearing, and there are different varieties in these two types of raspberries. And so it's important that you're planting the type that you mean to plant. And we will be talking about that later in the presentation. Secondly, it's important to have narrow rows when you plant your raspberry patch to promote airflow and make harvest easy. Whether you want a basic row like this, like what I like to do, or whether you want to have your raspberries in some fancy configuration, that's all fine and good. Just make sure that your rows are nice and narrow. You also want to have space on each side of the row for harvest, like we see in this photo here. Your raspberry patch doesn't have to look like a farm, but it sure can if you want it to. So this is my home raspberry patch. This is the fall bearing part of it. I planted this in 2020. It's a 30-foot long row, and the variety I have is something called Crimson Treasure. Now, unfortunately, this variety is not available to home gardeners. It's a new variety from Cornell University, and I and several farmers in Minnesota are trying it out experimentally to see how well it grows in our state. There are a few very similar varieties that are available to home gardeners, though, so don't worry. I use wood chip mulch underneath my row, and even though you can't see it here, my row is about 2 feet wide. And then surrounding my row of fall-bearing raspberries is just regular grass in my yard. So in this particular part of my yard, the grass isn't too nice. It's a lot of creeping Charlie with a mixture of some turf. I don't have a perfect lawn. It doesn't really matter what the ground cover is surrounding your raspberry patch as long as you don't have a lot of grass growing right underneath the row. I also have summer bearing raspberries in my raspberry patch, and I couldn't find a picture that really showed the whole patch, but this is a picture of one of those plants here with some of the fruit that started growing on it this year. I planted this one in 2009, and I planted just 5 plants, but over the last year they grew quite a bit and spread it, and so they formed a patch that's about 7 feet wide in what was previously a flower bed. The variety I have planted here is Nova, and it is a summer-bearing raspberry variety. However, it also produces some fruit in the fall, which is sort of a bonus of this variety. Another reason that I planted it is that research at University of Minnesota has found that it may be less appealing to Japanese beetles than another variety called Prelude. And so that was appealing to me, and I wanted to not have to control Japanese beetles as often, and so I chose to plant Nova. I also have wood chip mulch underneath these, and I don't like hand weeding a lot, and that's why I use the wood chip mulch. I think it's important before we go on to talk about how raspberries grow. So raspberries are a plant that sends up new canes from the ground every year. And this is important to know because it means that we need to do a lot of pruning every year on raspberries to keep them manageable and to make sure that they're still producing a lot of fruit each year. The pruning for raspberries does not take very long. It's not too complicated. We're not going to talk about that in this presentation though. So raspberry canes come up every year. When they are first growing, in their first year of growth, they are called primicanes. And those are labeled here. There's one primicane there, and there's 2 primicanes here on the left side. And then once those primicanes get through their first year of growth, and they begin their second year of growth, then they are called floricanes. So they put on woody bark on the outside, and they continue growing. Now, some raspberry varieties produce fruit on the floricane, so they produce fruit on the canes that have just started growing in that season. Other raspberry varieties are called summer-bearing varieties, and those produce fruit on the flora canes. So the canes will come up in one year, won't do anything, and then the next year, those canes will start putting on fruit. So these are the two different types of raspberries that we have. It's also important to know how raspberries spread and reproduce. So these root systems here, you can see that there's kind of this yellow line here. This is called a rhizome. And raspberries produce by sending out rhizomes, and those are just lateral roots. And those lateral roots will touch the surface of the soil and put down roots and send up new canes. And so if you plant one raspberry plant in your garden and think that it's just going to stay right there, you're probably wrong. It's probably going to spread, and you're going to get other raspberry plants coming up next to the original one. So that's how in my summer-bearing raspberry patch that I showed you in the last slide, I said I only planted 5 plants, but over the last year, year and a half, it has spread into a pretty wide 7-foot or so patch. Let's talk about those 2 types of raspberries that I mentioned in the last slide. The first is fall-bearing. So this means, obviously, that the fruit is produced in the fall. And that is because on a fall-bearing raspberry plant, the fruit is being produced on those primicanes, the new canes that have just come up that year. And so they will bear fruit on the canes that started that spring, and that fruit is produced anywhere between late July and the first frost. And this depends on the variety. So some fall-bearing raspberry varieties produce earlier than others. One of the really cool things about fall-bearing raspberries that makes them very easy for gardeners to manage is that there's no pruning required. If you want, you can just mow them down in the late fall every year. Because the fruit is produced on that year's canes, it makes it really easy. A trellis is really helpful for fall-bearing raspberries, especially if you're on very fertile soil. They're getting a lot of nutrients and they're getting very tall. Those canes are going to want something to support them. But a trellis is not 100% necessary, meaning a trellis will help you produce raspberries successfully, but the plants are not going to die if you don't have a trellis. Fall-bearing raspberries can live between 6 to 10 years, and they can potentially live longer if they're mowed every November rather than being mowed in the spring. This is a picture of a berry farm that is growing fall-bearing raspberries under their high tunnel. And the reason I'm showing you this is just to show what the fruit looks like when it's being produced on those primicanes. So you can see all these primicanes, they're very fresh, they're very new, they're very green, and you can see already those fruiting clusters. I've got a close-up here at the tops of the canes. So typically, this is where the fruit is going to be produced on primicane or fall-bearing raspberries, right at the tops of the canes. There are a couple of advantages of fall-bearing raspberries that I really like. The first is that, for me in my yard, I have a lot of deer coming through the neighborhood, and they like to eat the canes. If deer come through in the late fall or any time in the winter and they start eating the shoots, hey, guess what? It doesn't really matter, because with fall-bearing raspberries, we're gonna mow all those down in November or in the spring anyway. So if I have deer come through in November before I have a chance to mow them down, I don't really care all that much because I'm gonna mow them anyway. And because we mow them, pruning could not be easier for these types of raspberries. Now that I say that about pruning and mowing, that is just one way to manage your fall-bearing raspberries. There is another way you can do that. It's a little more complicated, but it means that you will have fruit not only in the fall, but also in the following summer. And so this is called double cropping for fall-bearing raspberries, and it's simply just a different way to prune them than just mowing them down every fall or spring. So how this works is in the spring, your primicanes are going to come up, and then in the fall, harvest berries off of those primicanes like you usually would. Then in late November or early December, instead of just mowing down all the canes, what you'll do is you'll clip the tops off of the canes that just produced. And where you're going to clip is right under the first, or in other words, the highest fruiting laterals. So those small branches that are producing fruit, those are your laterals. So clip right under that. And then the next season, what's going to happen is those canes, which are now floricanes, are going to push laterals and fruit from under where you clipped. And so you want to keep about the best 15 to 20 canes per meter of row and remove the rest, and then tie the remaining to the trellis, and then harvest fruit from those next summer. And then while this is happening, there are still going to be more primicanes coming up from the ground. And so during the fall, you can also harvest fruit from those primicanes. And then you just keep repeating that process year after year. Now, the yield in a double cropping system can sometimes be lower than in just a fall bearing system where you're mowing them down every year. So that can be a drawback, but the advantage is that you would be harvesting fruit both in the summer and the fall. So here's the other type of raspberries, summer-bearing raspberries. Again, these produce on the floricanes. To review, the floricanes are the second year growth of those canes. And so they will be producing fruit on the canes that started that previous year. And the fruit grows on lateral branches that come off of those main floricanes. And those lateral branches were initiated the previous fall. And so what this means for us is when we're pruning, you really don't want to cut off those lateral branches. It's important to keep those on. Summer-bearing raspberries can get really, really tall, and so it's important that they're trellised. If you don't trellis them, what happens is those canes are going to kind of fall down to the ground, and they can actually take root again, and you don't necessarily want that. They have an 8 to 15 year field life expectancy, but the fruit quality is expected to decrease after about 12 years. And if you're somebody who already has a raspberry patch in your yard and you're thinking, wow, these don't produce as well as they used to, it could be because these aren't meant to produce the same amount after about 12 years. They do tend to decline, and that's normal. So it's okay to replant your raspberry patch and continue to have high production. If you're somebody who's had your raspberry patch for 40 years and it's still producing well, kudos to you, but you don't have to expect that to be the norm. When you're pruning summer-bearing raspberries, what you do is you prune off the used up floricanes in the winter. In other words, you prune off the ones that have old fruiting bodies left over from last year on them. And then those are used up, they're not going to produce anymore. Again, I'm not going to be going into pruning in this presentation, but I'm just trying to give you a little overview of what these systems look like. So here's a picture of some summer-bearing raspberries in my yard. Unfortunately, again, this is the best one that I could find, but this fruit was being produced on June 18th of 2020. One of the drawbacks of summer-bearing raspberries up here in the cold north of Minnesota is that sometimes we can get these really early fall snowfalls or freezes, and that can hurt the fruit-producing part of those canes, the floricanes, or for the next season. And so, for instance, this is what happened in October of last year in my yard, and some of those floricanes, they're not going to die, but some of them might have some winter damage because of that. The other thing is that since we do need those canes to survive the winter and produce next year, if you have deer coming through eating those shoots, that can be a problem for the next year. And if you have a big raspberry patch, it can be hard to keep deer off of them all winter long. Now let's go into varieties. And I'm going to be talking mostly about red raspberry varieties here, but I do have a list of yellow and purple and black raspberries as well. So there are 35 summer or floricane fruiting varieties as far as the reds, and then 30 primicane fruiting varieties. There are a couple of different places that I like to direct people to learn about varieties. The first is this Cornell nursery guide. It has a lot of good information on raspberry varieties. And the second is the University of Minnesota raspberry homepage called Growing Raspberries in the Home Garden. Both of these are going to be very helpful. Here are some of the varieties recommended for Minnesota gardeners as far as summer-bearing raspberries go. These are Boyne, Killarney, Nova, Latham, Encore, and Festival. And this is a picture of some Nova raspberries right here. Again, Nova is one of my favorite varieties because of how it produces in the summer, but then puts on a little bit of fruit in the fall as well. It's kind of fun. You know, I said on the last slide that there were, 30, 35 varieties available for summer bearing. But the reason why we don't recommend all of those for Minnesota is not all of them are hardy enough to reliably grow here. But the varieties we do have available to us are very nice. And yeah, so you still have a good selection. As far as the primocane or the fall producing fruits, the standard varieties that are tested and true and or tried and tested in Minnesota and we know grow well here include Polana, Autumn Britain, Joan Jay, Polka, Himbo Top, Anne, and Caroline. And then there are some newer varieties that have come out more recently. The first one is called BP1, not a very exciting name, I know. And then three from Cornell, Double Gold, Crimson Giant, and Crimson Knight. And again, there's another one called Crimson Treasure, which is what I grow in my yard, but I didn't list it here because it's not available to home gardeners. This is what Crimson Knight looks like. It's definitely a darker berry. So if that's something that you're interested in, try this one out. So it's uniquely dark, it's fall bearing, and the thing about this one is its hardiness in Minnesota is still currently being tested for the first time. This past year it was planted at one farm. So we want to see how well it does at that farm before I can widely recommend this one. But if you're somebody who wants to experiment with new things, you can give this variety a try. It is available for purchase online. This is the list, the table, rather, listing the red raspberry varieties that we recommend for northern gardens. This is from the University of Minnesota Extension website on growing raspberries in the home garden, and the link you can see is right there. And so this includes both the primocane and the floricane types. So make sure that when you're ordering raspberry varieties, you're ordering the right type for what you intended. The hardiness listed here, you know, if it says good to fair, that means it's going to be good in USDA Zone 4 and, you know, basically in general, the southern half of Minnesota, and Zone 3 further north, it would be more to fair. And then we have descriptions for each of these so you can learn a little bit more about them to decide which varieties you want to try. As I said, there are a few yellow, purple, and black raspberry varieties recommended for northern gardeners as well, and these are listed here. Not all of them are very hardy. As you can see, Black Hawk, it says fair to poor, which means it might grow okay in Zone 4, but it's not going to grow very well in Zone 3, so we would not recommend it in northern Minnesota. Same with this Bristol variety. But something like Anne, I know Anne is a very popular one. It's yellow. Fall Gold, I don't know anyone growing this one, but it's recommended. Very good to good hardiness. And then another one that you could try is Honey Queen, which is another yellow. This is a primocane fruiting blackberry, and blackberries do grow differently than raspberries. So not everything in this presentation is going to apply to a blackberry, but I just wanted to mention this. This is called Primark Freedom. It's thornless, it's upright. We don't know how hardy its roots are, and we don't know how hardy it's going to be in Minnesota at this point in time. There are just a handful of farmers here and there who are experimenting with primocane fruiting blackberries. But the reason why you might be able to grow them is that they can be mulched in the winter. And so you might be able to protect those tender root systems just by mulching. They do require a lot of heat in order to grow in the summer, so you should have a long, hot growing season to grow these successfully. This is the Cornell website, blogs.cornell.edu/berry nurseries, where you can go to get a lot of information about these raspberry cultivars that we've been talking about today. So next, once you've selected your varieties, let's talk about how to go about planting them. And the first thing that you want to do before planting your raspberries is to choose a site where you're going to plant them in your yard. It's really important for raspberries to have full sun for most or all of the day. And that may seem counterintuitive if you grew up around wild raspberries, but cultivated or non-wild raspberries do produce best in full sun. They actually don't like being in the shade. You see wild raspberries growing in the shade, sort of at forest edges, but we're trying to get better production on these, and so for the best fruit, you need to have them in full sun. I would avoid spots like directly against a north side of a fence or a building. So in this picture here, this white fence, it's my neighbor's fence, we're actually on the north side of it. I would not want to plant my raspberries directly against that fence because, as you can see, in the middle of the day, that whole side of the fence is shaded. However, where I planted it, which is about 5 or 6 feet out from the fence, this is actually full sun the entire day, every day. And then I would also avoid planting directly against the south side of a building where it gets very hot. You can tell if it's hotter in that area just by putting a thermometer or potentially even noticing when the snow starts melting in that spot in the winter. And it can really just kind of fry your plants, so you don't want them to be getting too hot during the day. And then I would also avoid soggy areas in your yard where water pools, because just like most fruiting plants or vegetables that we grow, they really don't like being in really wet soil or standing water. So the next part I'm going to talk about is how to plant and trellis your raspberries. And again, I'm going to be using my yard as an example. When my husband and I established this row of raspberries last year, I thought, hey, I should use this as a demonstration for the master gardeners or the gardeners in Minnesota at some point in time. And so I did take a lot of pictures and video of us putting together this row. What we have is a 30-foot row, again, of fall-bearing raspberries, like I talked about before. I live in Chanhassen, Minnesota, and we planted this in May of 2020. The first step is to find a space that you want to plant them and measure out your row. What you need is a 2-foot wide strip of soil with at least 3 feet on either side so that you can get through and harvest. And so when the canes start growing and sort of toppling over a little bit, they have space to expand. The length of the row should be about 2 feet longer than what your goal length is. So in other words, when you're tilling up that soil, you want to till a space that's a little bit longer than what you actually want planted. And that's so that you don't want the first and last plants to be nudging up against compacted soil. You want the first and last plants to be in nice, fluffy, tilled soil. So since I wanted a row that was 30 feet long, I actually tilled up 32 feet. So you're going to till up that 2-foot wide strip of soil, and the tilled soil, when you're done, should be between 8 to 12 inches deep. There's me using a borrowed rototiller from a fellow coworker, Julie, to till up my row of raspberries. And having this depth, this 12-inch depth tilled, allows those roots to expand after you plant the plants and to colonize the soil in order to find nutrients and water that they need to grow. And this is especially important if you're planting into established turf. The ground underneath turf can be really compacted, especially if your turf has been around a long time. If you're planting in something that's already a garden, like maybe it's been a vegetable garden for a long time, it's not going to be as critical to go through and till for a long time. But I was doing this in established turf, and so I actually went over this row with a tiller probably 6 or 7 times just to get deep down in there and to get that soil nice and fluffy. And this is a lot easier if the turf was killed the year before by herbicides. And so, I don't use a lot of chemicals in my yard, but in order to plant this raspberry patch, I decided I wanted to use Roundup, glyphosate to kill the grass there the year before. This is totally optional. And when I planted my vegetable garden, I did not do that. It just took a lot longer to till because you're having to break up a lot of turf roots. And so this is what I chose to do. The third step, add fertilizer. This should be done before you plant because these granular fertilizers contain phosphorus and potassium, which are nutrients that aren't very mobile. And so you want to make sure you're incorporating that fertilizer throughout the top 8 to 12 inches of the soil so that it can hit those roots and the roots can get those nutrients right after planting rather than just sprinkling it on top. So make sure you don't forget this step. The soil pH for raspberries should be between about 6 and 7. Raspberries, like many other plants, need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to grow. These are called macronutrients, meaning that plants use a lot of them. And you also need soil organic matter in your soil in order to absorb water, keep it there, and provide nutrients. It also helps hold in those nutrients so that they don't leach out of the soil. Before planting, it's a good idea to get a soil test from the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab. And this is something where you take the sample and you send it into the lab, and then they send you back your results about 2 weeks later. And so this is something you would need to plan ahead for. If you're planning on planting in May, maybe submit your soil sample in April so that you get it back in time to plant. Add the soil NPK to the tilled soil. And this is an example of an NPK fertilizer here. And on this package, it says 10, 10, 10 down at the bottom. That means it's 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. You want these 3 nutrients to be included in the fertilizer when you plant it. So you're going to add it to the tilled soil, you're going to mix it in so that it's well incorporated, and as far as how much to add, just follow the directions on the back of the package. And then you can also add compost when you're planting, but if your soil organic matter is already pretty good, it's not necessary to add the compost, and you really don't want to add too much. Obviously, there are a lot of advantages to adding compost to your soil because it adds that good organic matter and it adds good microbes to your soil. But if you add too much, it could actually create a soil environment where the water has a hard time absorbing. And I've run into this problem myself before. So make sure when you're adding compost, you're not dumping it on, you're not adding an excessive amount of it. So this is just an example of the fertilizer that I have at home that I happened to take a picture of. But there are many, many options available at garden centers and hardware stores. When you receive your plants, they may come as bare root plants, but they may also come as small plugs, which are those small little root systems in plastic and with a couple of leaves on them, or you might also buy them as potted plants. In this picture here, these are bare root plants. And so as you can see, the bare root plants are sort of just a root system with a stick, and then they will put out leaves after you plant them. When you plant, you're going to lightly wet the soil beforehand so that that soil is not bone dry. You don't want those roots just going into absolutely dry soil. And then form a hole in the tilled soil that's slightly deeper than the root ball. And in my patch, we actually used plug plants. This is what the nursery happened to send us. And so they had 3 to 4 leaves per plant and a very, very small root ball. And so we did not need to dig very big holes for each plant. The bare root plants, like you see here, look like sticks with roots. They won't have any leaves yet. And some people will use a rooting hormone to try to get them to establish faster. A rooting hormone is not necessary. I haven't seen any advantage of it myself, but it's not harmful either. And so if that's something that you're interested in using, go ahead. After planting, this is what they look like. So if you use bare root plants, they will start putting out leaves a few days after planting. And so you can see the old stick here and some leaves coming out of it. And these leaves are ultimately going to form your first primocane and next year your first floricane that will produce fruit. And if you planted with plug plants that come in the little trays, those are going to come out a lot shorter. They won't have a stick attached to them. And so this is what they look like in my place. The plug plants are typically going to establish a lot slower than the bare root plants, just as an FYI. This is what my patch looked like on June 18th, so about a month after planting. And you can see that nice wood chip mulch that we've put down is still doing a good job of keeping out the weeds. In the summer, after you plant, make sure to water every 1 or 2 days. You won't necessarily need to do this on an established raspberry patch, but in that planting year, watering it frequently is very important to help those little plants establish and be healthy. And in order to figure out how much you need to water, you can feel the top inch of the soil with your finger. And if it's wet, you don't really need to water. If it's dry, that's a symbol that it's time to water. It's not too complicated, but this is a way to avoid overwatering. So if you reach your finger in there to the top inch of soil and you can feel that it's already moist, that means that you should think about not watering, just to make sure those roots don't get too soggy. Wood chip mulch does help contain soil moisture, but it still does dry out. And so if you think, oh, well, I have mulch on there, I'm going to go on vacation for 2 weeks and not water, you might be in trouble when you come back. It's also important if you have a lot of creeping Charlie in your yard to remove the creeping Charlie and other perennial weeds from the row of your raspberries, especially when you're establishing a new raspberry patch. Established plants, let's say 3 or 4 years old, yes, they can compete pretty well with weeds. but when they're new like this, they don't do a very good job of competing with weeds. So it is important to get those perennial weeds out of there. This is what my patch looked like by September. And so what you can see is that some of those canes are getting really tall and they're basically just toppling over. And some varieties do this more than others. There are some varieties that have very upright canes and some that have very droopy canes. And so this is why it's very important to build a trellis that's tall enough for your plants so that it can keep them in, basically contain them between the wires. And so that's what we're going to be talking about next, how to build a basic and durable trellis for your raspberry patch. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of different configurations that you could potentially grow raspberries in. In my particular yard, I really just like growing things in neat, straight rows. And so that's what I did with my fall-bearing raspberry patch. And so I'm going to be showing you how to build a basic trellis for raspberries. And then you can think about how to customize this for your own situation. So a function of a trellis, again, is to contain those canes, which tend to get tall and topple over. It also makes harvest a lot easier because the fruit is being elevated, not down near the ground. To do this, you're going to need a few materials. First, metal posts, and you can use T-posts or you can use rebar. I like using those T-posts that have holes in them. Secondly, you're going to need wire. I use 12.5 gauge high tensile wire. You can also use twine for your trellis if you want to keep things really simple and skip a lot of steps that we're about to talk about. Twine doesn't work as well as wire, but it's certainly easier to install. If you use wire, you're going to need Gripples and a Gripple Tool and steel ground anchors for the ends of the rows to secure the wires. These are the orange anchors that you see in the photo. You're going to need a metal bar, which is used to install the anchors. And then since you're working with high tensile wire, it's important to have safety equipment, gloves, safety glasses, and wire cutters. This wire does tend to spring back at you sometimes because it's high tension, and so it's especially important to have those safety glasses.
Safety first. As you saw, I have my safety glasses on. We're both going to be wearing some nice thick work gloves. That's because we're dealing with high tensile trellis wire. This stuff has a lot of tension in it, and so it can snap back at you while you're working with it. Very important to cover your eyes and your hands while you're working with this. We're going to be using a Gripple system in order to secure the trellis wire onto the posts, and this is the tool that we use to install the Gripples. Alright, so also we're going to need some anchor posts to some earth anchors rather, to anchor the end posts in so that the tension on the wire doesn't pull them inward onto the row and they stay in place. And this is a metal bar that we're going to be using to actually screw those earth anchors in. Alright, so we're going to get started and we'll be back soon.
Here's a diagram of my trellis system. Let's start from the bottom. This little orange dot that you see down here, this is the anchor that has been twisted into the ground. It's called an earth anchor. And these are the wires that are going between the end posts and the earth anchor. And this helps keep those end posts in place so they don't get pulled inside towards the rest of the trellis. It helps keep everything tight. So these are the tight wires that are going from the end post to the anchor. Let's go over here to the left. These are your metal end posts. When these particular posts have holes in them, which is very nice because it allows us to string that wire through them. I think those holes are a very nice feature. And here we have the wires. So our top wires, we've got one on each side, in other words, one attached to each post, and then a lower layer of wire, again, one on each side. So the first step you're going to want to do after you put in your posts, your end posts, is to twist in those earth anchors. So you want to twist those into the ground about 3 feet past the end posts on both sides of the row, as you see here. And you use that metal post to actually help you install those earth anchors. All of this you can get at any regular farm store like Fleet Farm. And so then what you're going to do is you're going to take a piece of wire, cut to the right length, and loop that wire between each end post around the anchor. And so you're going to make one loop on each side that goes between the anchor post and the end post. And then what you're going to do is to close that loop, Since it's a wire and you can't tie it, you want to use something called a gripple to close it. So these are what gripples look like, and you can get these at basic farm stores, or you can order them online. They're not too expensive, and they're going to be really helpful for a lot of garden projects you might do that involve trellises. And so you take the two ends of your wire loop, and this was supposed to be a video, but it's not allowing me to play it in the recording, so sorry about that. But you take the two ends of your wire and you stick them through the holes in the gripple, and then that gripple grabs onto them really, really tightly and won't let them go, and so it allows you to make a nice tight loop.
All right, so we cut a piece of wire that is long enough that we've strung it between the pole and the anchor here. And so what we have to do now is we have to use this gripple in order to connect these two wires. Okay, so I'm going to string the wire through the gripple here. Again, we go through the big hole like that, and then the other wire goes in the big hole on the other side, like this. All right, and so now I'm going to pull a bunch of the extra through. And then we'll tighten the rest of the way with the Gripple tool. Okay.
And then what you do after making your loop with the gripple is you use what's called a Gripple Tool, which is what we're showing here, in order to tighten that gripple. And again, this was supposed to be a video, but it's not allowing me to play it. This is very simple though, and it's very easy to find lots of videos online about how to use this tool. You basically put the tool around the gripple and you pull it apart, and that tightens the wire. It pulls the wire through the gripple, making your loop tighter and tighter.
Do you want to show like how this goes in and everything?
You're doing it right now.
And so after you have done your wires between your end post and the anchor, the next step is to string the wires along the length of the row, and then again tighten them and close the loops with the gripples. And so what you're going to do is you're going to cut a piece of wire that's a few feet longer than the length of the row. And so we just kind of pulled the wire along the ground next to it and cut it so it was a few feet longer, about 3 feet longer on each side than the length of the row. And then you're going to string the wire down the row and put the ends through the holes on all of the end posts. And then you're going to use, basically you just then make a loop with a little bit of the extra wire on the end, and then put a gripple on there and close the loop with the gripple. And so that's how you get your wires strung across. It's pretty simple. And then once you have the gripple that's connecting the loop there, you can use the gripple tool to tighten it. And so you're going to have basically one loop on each side on each piece of wire. And then basically you just want to do this again on lower levels. So in total, you're making 2 to 3 levels of wire. This is my highest one, and it happens to be sitting at about 3 feet. And then I have one at about 18 inches as well that you can kind of see down below here. And what this does, by having multiple levels, you're supporting the canes as they grow and keeping them contained inside. The suggested heights for the wire are about 18 inches, 24 inches, 36, and then 48 inches if needed, if your canes are getting really tall and if you have posts that are tall enough to support that. And then as the canes grow up, you're going to periodically push them through the wires when needed so that they're growing up vertically and they're not falling out between the wires. And so I just go through every few weeks and do this. It's not a big deal. It doesn't take a lot of time. And then if needed, you can even tie the canes to the wires with a piece of twine or with a tapener to keep them supported and growing upright. So that's about it. And I wanted to show you another example if you don't want to use wire, high tensile wire for your trellis. This is what it would look like if you use twine. And it's really important with doing a trellis that you find the right kind of twine. You need to find one that has no stretch to it at all. And this can be kind of difficult, I have found out. You might need to order it online. I've been finding that a lot of twines that I'm finding at hardware stores and garden centers do have too much stretch for them, and they do stretch and get saggy over time. So this is a particular kind that doesn't stretch. When you install this, you need to pull it very tightly, and you need to use metal sturdy posts that don't have any wiggle to them at all in order to just keep everything nice and tight. In summary, I'm excited for everyone to go out and plant a new raspberry patch this season. It can be really rewarding to have raspberries in your garden. It's one of those fruit crops that's not too difficult to grow, and I really like that it starts producing fruit either the season you plant them or the season after. So, a few take-home messages about this great crop. First, choose the right varieties for your garden to meet your goals. You need to choose between summer or fall bearing raspberry varieties, and make sure you're choosing a variety that's hardy enough for your area. Second, choose the right site. You want a sunny, well-drained site, not right up against a fence or on the south or north side of the building. So hopefully you can find the perfect spot in your garden for raspberries. Third, you want to plant into fertilized, well-tilled soil. So make sure you get that fertilizer, maybe get a little compost in there, and get that worked in before you plant. After you plant your raspberries, keep those watered regularly, a couple of times a week, especially if it hasn't been raining. And keep those watered throughout the whole season, mulch them, and then make sure they're weeded so that those plants can grow nice and strong and don't have anything to compete with. Build a trellis in order to keep the canes growing upright. You can do this with simple metal posts and wires, or you can try twine. If you're using wires, use Gripples to keep that wire nice and tight along the trellis. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today, and happy gardening.